"I'm sorry, I can't afford this date," she whispered to the single dad, tears pooling in her eyes as her car was declined. But instead of judging her, he leaned forward with kind eyes and said, "Don't worry, I'm broke too." She thought she'd finally found someone who understood her struggle. She had no idea she was falling for the biggest lie of her life. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and it proves that powerful stories resonate everywhere. Suzanne Wong was completely broke when she met David Kirsten. She had exactly $47 in her bank account and a maxed-out credit card. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, but jobs were scarce. Most of her income went to her sick mother and two younger siblings who were still in school. Suzanne was the oldest child in an immigrant family, and she felt responsible for everyone. On their first date at an Italian restaurant in Chicago, Suzanne ordered only water and the cheapest appetizer. She was terrified that David would find out she had no money. He seemed successful and put together. He talked about being an architect and raising his 6-year-old son Leo alone after his wife died. Suzanne wanted desperately for him to like her. When the bill came, Suzanne tried to pay her share. The waiter returned and told her that her card had been declined. Suzanne was mortified. She started crying right there at the table. This was her worst nightmare coming true. She apologized to David and admitted that she was completely broke and shouldn't have come on the date. David surprised her by saying he was broke too. He paid for the meal with cash and suggested they take a walk. As they walked along the Chicago River, David explained that his architecture firm was failing. He had started the company 5 years ago, right before his wife died of cancer. The business never recovered. He was barely keeping alive, while also paying off his late wife's medical bills and taking care of Leo. David said he lived in a cheap apartment and drove an old car. He and Leo ate mostly pasta and rice because that was what he could afford. He admitted he probably shouldn't have spent money on the restaurant meal, but he wanted to make a good impression. Suzanne felt enormous relief. David understood what it was like to be poor and ashamed. She told him about sending all her money to her mother and having to choose between eating and paying rent. They spent hours talking about their financial struggles and fears. By the end of the night, Suzanne felt closer to David than she had felt to anyone in years. They started dating seriously after that. They called it their poverty pact, a commitment to be completely honest about money and only do free or very cheap activities. They had picnics in parks with homemade sandwiches. They went to museums on discount days. They took Leo to the library for free story time. Their dates were creative but always inexpensive. Suzanne fell in love with both David and Leo over the next few months. Leo was a sweet boy who loved playing at parks and baking cookies in Suzanne's tiny apartment. David was kind and patient. He made Suzanne laugh even when she was stressed. He never judged her for being poor because he claimed to be in the same situation. About 3 months into their relationship, David told Suzanne he was short on grocery money. A client payment had fallen through, and he wouldn't have cash until the following week. Suzanne had $60 from a small freelance job. She needed that money for her own food, but she gave it all to David. He had a child to feed, and she believed they were partners who helped each other. David seemed very emotional when he accepted the money. He hugged Suzanne and promised to pay her back. She told him not to worry about it. That night, Susan felt happy despite her empty wallet. She had never been in a relationship where she could be completely honest about being poor. With David, she didn't have to pretend to be successful. Over the following weeks, their relationship grew deeper. David talked about wanting to grow his business someday. Suzanne talked about hoping to build a stable client base. They both dreamed of a day when money wouldn't be such a constant worry. They introduced each other to their families. Suzanne's mother liked David and said he seemed genuine. Leo bonded strongly with Suzanne and started calling her Susie. Suzanne did have moments of doubt. She wondered if their relationship could survive long-term if they were both always broke. She also felt guilty about the money she had given David, especially on nights when she was too hungry to sleep. She had lost weight because she was eating less to save money, but she pushed these worries aside. They were partners in struggle, and she believed their love could overcome anything. David seemed to be struggling too. His car broke down twice, and he had to borrow money from his parents. He mentioned more clients delaying payments. He looked tired and stressed. Suzanne wanted to help him more, but she barely had anything. She started taking extra freelance work, even projects that paid very little, just to have a bit more money to contribute. One evening, David called sounding very upset. A major client had canceled a project, which meant he couldn't pay himself that month. All his money was going to keep the business running and take care of Leo's needs. He said he didn't know if he should close the business and just get a regular job for stable income. Suzanne encouraged him not to give up. She told him he was a good father and a talented architect. She said success sometimes takes time, and they would figure things out together. After they hung up, Suzanne felt exhausted from both their struggles. But she loved David and Leo, and she believed their relationship could survive poverty. She had no idea that everything she believed was based on a complete lie. 4 months into the relationship, Suzanne was desperately trying to earn extra money. She took a second job doing deliveries for local businesses. The pay was terrible, but every dollar helped. One Tuesday, she got assigned to deliver pastries from a bakery to a downtown Chicago address. The address was in an expensive part of the city with tall glass buildings. When Suzanne arrived and checked the building directory, she saw something that made her freeze. Kirsten Architecture Plus Design, LLC, Suite 2800, David Kirsten, CEO and founder. Suzanne couldn't believe what she was reading. This had to be a mistake or a different David Kirsten. But deep down, she knew it was him. The security guard directed her to the 28th floor. When the elevator doors opened, Suzanne found herself in a beautiful, modern office with expensive furniture and artwork everywhere. There were at least 30 employees working. This was clearly not a failing business. The receptionist took the pastry delivery. Suzanne stood in the lobby, unable to move. Through glass conference room walls, she saw David. He was wearing an expensive suit she had never seen. He was presenting something to about 10 people, looking confident and in charge. This wasn't the stressed, struggling man she thought she knew. Suzanne left the building in shock. She sat in her car, trying to understand. Maybe the business had suddenly recovered. Maybe David hadn't had time to tell her. But these explanations felt weak. Something made Suzanne stay and watch the building entrance. At 6 o'clock, David emerged, still in the expensive suit, talking on his phone and laughing. He walked to the parking garage. Minutes later, a brand new black Range Rover drove out with David behind the wheel. That car probably cost more than Suzanne would earn in 5 years. Suzanne followed the Range Rover. She watched David drive not to his cheap apartment, but to a wealthy suburb called Winnetka. He pulled into the driveway of a huge modern house worth at least $1 million. Leo ran out and jumped into David's arms. A woman who looked like a nanny stood in the doorway, waving goodbye. Suzanne sat in her car down the street until dark. She watched the lights turn on in the beautiful house. Everything David had told her was a lie. The failing business was a lie. The cheap apartment was a lie. The old car was a lie. David was rich and successful, and he had been pretending to be poor, while Suzanne actually was poor. Suzanne drove home in shock. When she got to her studio apartment, she sat on her couch and stared at the wall. She thought about all the money she had given him. She thought about the meals she had skipped to help him. She thought about the extra work she had taken on. She had been working herself to exhaustion to help a man who was secretly wealthy. The betrayal felt like a physical pain. Suzanne had shared her deepest shame with David, her poverty, her guilt about her family, her fear of not being good enough. He had pretended to share that shame while living in luxury. She had fallen in love with Leo, and now she wondered if any of it had been real. Suzanne didn't sleep that night. She tried to understand why someone would do this. Why would a wealthy man pretend to be poor? What did he gain from lying to her? By morning, her sadness had turned to anger. She deserved answers. She texted David, "We need to talk. Tonight, I'll come to your real house in Winnetka." His response was immediate. "Okay, 8 p.m. No denial, no confusion. Just an acknowledgement that she knew the truth. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers. but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to my channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. That evening, Suzanne drove to David's real house in Winnetka. The house was even more impressive up close, a modern architectural masterpiece with huge windows and beautiful lighting. When David answered the door, he looked nervous. He had sent Leo to his parents' house so they could talk alone. Suzanne walked into the beautiful home and demanded answers. She wanted complete truth about everything. David admitted that his architecture firm wasn't failing. It was one of the most successful firms in Chicago, earning over $15 million the previous year. He wasn't struggling financially at all. He had never needed help with groceries or bills. The apartment Suzanne had visited was a rental property David owned that he had staged to look lived in. The old car belonged to one of his employees. Everything had been a carefully constructed lie. Suzanne asked how David could claim to love her when he had been lying from the beginning. She pointed out that he had watched her struggle, skip meals, and work multiple jobs while he lived in luxury. She reminded him that he had taken money from her that she desperately needed. David looked devastated, but tried to explain. After his wife Emma died, David had tried dating again. But every woman he met only cared about his money. They would research his company before dates. They would ask about his income and assets. One woman he dated for 2 months told her friend she could overlook the dead wife baggage because David was worth millions. David started to believe his money made it impossible to find real love. So David came up with a plan. He would pretend to be financially struggling and see if he could meet someone who would love him without the wealth. He wanted to find someone who would stay through hard times. When Suzanne's car was declined on their first date, David saw an opportunity. He decided to test whether she would love him even if he had nothing. Suzanne was furious. She told David he had manipulated her and used her real poverty as his testing ground. She explained that his fear of gold diggers and her actual financial struggle were completely different things. He was playing a role while she was living her actual life. When he went home to his mansion, she went home to ration rice and beans. David admitted he had planned to keep up the pretense for only a few weeks. But then he fell in love with Suzanne. He claimed his feelings became real quickly. He wanted to tell her the truth, but was afraid she would change if she knew he was wealthy. Every day he put off a confession because he was scared of losing her. Suzanne told David that even if his feelings became real, the foundation was still a lie. Everything they shared about money and struggle had been asymmetrical. He was playing a character while she was being completely vulnerable. She pointed out that even after he fell in love with her, he still watched her suffer and did nothing. He watched her stress about money, work multiple jobs, and lose weight from not eating enough. David said he hated himself for that. He admitted he was a coward who kept lying because he was afraid. He revealed that he had planned to tell Susan the truth that weekend and asked her to marry him. He hoped his honesty and commitment would show that he wanted a real future together. Suzanne laughed bitterly at the idea of marrying him. She said it was too late. He couldn't undo what he had done. He had used her poverty as a test and manipulated her emotions. She asked about Leo and whether he had been part of the lie. David quickly said Leo knew nothing and really did love Suzanne. That information hurt Suzanne even more because she had fallen in love with Leo too. Suzanne told David that he had broken something that couldn't be repaired. He had taken her trust, vulnerability, and love and treated them as disposable. He had prioritized his fear over her reality. David was crying and apologizing, saying he would do anything to take it back. Suzanne said that was the thing about betrayal. You can apologize for it, but you can't undo it. The damage was done. She walked out of the house and drove away while David called after her. As Suzanne drove home, she cried harder than she had in years. She felt like a fool for believing David's lies. She felt angry at herself for not seeing the signs. But mostly, she felt heartbroken. She had opened her heart to David and Leo, and now she had to walk away from both of them. The weeks after the confrontation were the hardest of Suzanne's life. David tried to contact her constantly, calls, texts, emails. He sent flowers to her apartment. He wrote long letters explaining his feelings. Suzanne ignored everything. She couldn't imagine forgiving him. But then strange things started happening. Suzanne's bank account suddenly showed a deposit that covered all her credit card debt. She called the bank and learned it had come from an anonymous donor. Her mother called to say that someone had paid her medical bills in full. Suzanne knew it was David, but she didn't know how to feel about it. Then David started showing up at the coffee shop, where Suzanne sometimes worked on her laptop. He didn't approach her or try to talk. He just sat across the room with Leo, helping his son with homework. Leo would occasionally look over at Suzanne with sad eyes, clearly missing her. It broke Suzanne's heart. After 2 weeks of this, Suzanne finally walked over to their table. Leo's face lit up immediately. David looked hopeful but scared. Suzanne sat down and told David that paying her debts didn't fix what he had done. David agreed. He said he wasn't trying to buy forgiveness. He was trying to undo some of the harm his lies had caused. Over the next few weeks, David kept showing up places Suzanne went, but he never pushed for conversation. He just made himself available. Sometimes Suzanne would sit with him and Leo for a few minutes. Slowly, they started talking again. David was completely honest now. He answered every question Suzanne had about his life, his business, his wealth. He showed her his real financial statements, his real home, his real life. David also did something Suzanne didn't expect. He introduced her to his therapist. David admitted he had started therapy after Suzanne left. He was working on understanding why he had been so afraid of being used for his money that he ended up using someone else's poverty. His therapist helped him see that his fear of gold diggers had made him behave just as manipulatively as the people he was trying to avoid. Suzanne appreciated David's honesty, but she still didn't trust him. She told him that trust takes years to build and seconds to destroy. David said he understood and would spend as long as it took to rebuild what he had broken. The turning point came when Leo asked Suzanne directly why she had stopped coming around. David had told his son that he had made a big mistake and hurt Suzanne's feelings. Leo asked Suzanne if she could forgive his dad because everyone makes mistakes and deserves second chances. Coming from a 6-year-old, the wisdom hit differently. Suzanne realized something important. David's wealth had been fake, and his poverty had been fake. But 3 things had been real. His grief over losing his wife, his love for Leo, and his loneliness. Those were the things that had driven him to make terrible choices. They didn't excuse what he did, but they explained it. Suzanne also realized that she had to decide what she wanted. Did she want to hold on to her hurt forever? Or did she want to see if something real could grow from the ruins of David's lies? It was the hardest decision she had ever faced. After 6 weeks, Suzanne agreed to have dinner with David, a real conversation about their future. They met at a simple restaurant, nothing fancy. David told Suzanne that he had quit lying about everything in his life. He had told his family and friends what he had done. He had told his business partner. He wasn't hiding anymore. David said he couldn't undo the past, but he could promise a different future. He wanted a relationship built on complete honesty, even when the truth was uncomfortable. He wanted to support Suzanne's career and dreams without controlling her. He wanted to be a partner, not a manipulator. Suzanne told David that she needed him to understand something important. His lie hadn't just hurt her feelings. It had exploited her poverty. Rich people pretending to be poor is not the same as poor people pretending to be rich. He had played with something that caused her real daily suffering. That power imbalance made his betrayal especially cruel. David listened and agreed completely. He admitted he had been blind to his own privilege. He had been so focused on protecting his money that he didn't see how his test had exploited someone with no money. He said he was ashamed of what he had done and was working to be better. 3 months after confrontation, David asked Suzanne if he could propose to her properly, not with manipulation or tests, just with honesty. Suzanne said yes. David proposed at the park where they used to take Leo during their poverty-packed days. He used his late wife's ring, which he said represented family and commitment, not wealth. He told Suzanne that he had started their relationship by testing her, but now he was asking her to take a leap of faith with him. He promised no more lies, no more tests, just 2 imperfect people choosing to build a life together. Suzanne said yes, but she had conditions. They would get couples counseling before the wedding. David would sign a prenuptial agreement that protected Suzanne financially, but also gave her independence. And most importantly, they would volunteer together at organizations that help people in poverty. So David would truly understand the reality of the struggles he had faked. David agreed to everything immediately. They got married 6 months later in a small ceremony. Suzanne's family was there, and Leo was the ring bearer. During the ceremony, David's vows included an apology. He acknowledged publicly that he had hurt Suzanne deeply and promised to spend their marriage proving that his love was real, even if his poverty had been fake. Suzanne's vows were honest too. She said she was choosing to forgive David, but forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. She would carry the memory of his betrayal as a reminder to guard her heart. But she was willing to build something new with him because she believed people could change and grow. Their marriage wasn't perfect. Suzanne sometimes had moments of doubt when she wondered if David was being completely honest. David sometimes struggled with guilt over what he had done, but they went to therapy together. They talked through problems instead of hiding them. They built a life based on transparency. David helped Suzanne's mother and siblings financially, but he always asked Suzanne first and respected her boundaries. He supported Suzanne's freelance business and eventually helped her open her own design studio. They made sure Leo understood the value of money and didn't grow up entitled. And they volunteered together at a food bank every month. David met people who were living the struggle he had only pretended to experience. He heard their stories and understood the weight of poverty in a way he never had before. It humbled him and made him a better person. Years later, when people asked Suzanne how she could forgive David after such a big betrayal, she gave an honest answer. She said that David's poverty had been a performance, but his transformation was real. He had been a man so afraid of being used that he used someone else. But he became a man who acknowledged his mistakes and worked every day to be better. Susan also admitted that forgiveness hadn't come easily or quickly. It had taken years of David proving himself. It had required him to be vulnerable in ways that scared him. It had meant both of them doing the hard work of rebuilding trust brick by brick. In the end, Suzanne and David's story wasn't about a perfect romance. It was about two flawed people who hurt each other, chose honesty, and worked to build something real from the ashes of deception. David's wealth had been real while his poverty was fake. But the love they eventually built, messy, complicated, and hard won, that was the only thing that truly mattered. Their journey from broke together to building together taught them both important lessons. David learned that testing people's love is itself an act of betrayal. Suzanne learned that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. It means choosing to move forward while remembering the past. And Leo, who grew up watching his father work to earn back trust, learned that making mistakes is human, but taking responsibility for them is what makes you a good person. The lie that started everything had changed their lives. But the truth they chose to live every day after, that was what defined them. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to my channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now let's continue.